I've been interviewed twice in my life by Oprah, in 2014 and in 2019. And after the second interview, she says to me, I've rarely seen somebody change so much. You were so emotionally blocked before. And that was like a good moment for me. And she should know, she's Oprah, right? And the weird thing is, and the sad thing for our country, is that as I was making a journey toward becoming more fully human, the country was making a journey to becoming less human and more dehumanized. And there are all sorts of statistics. I won't recite them all, but we all know the suicide is up by 30%, depression rates are skyrocketing, 36% of Americans report feeling lonely frequently, 45% of teenagers say they feel despondent and hopeless most of the time. The number of people who say they have no close personal friends has gone up by 4 times. 36% more Americans are not in a romantic relationship. The number of Americans who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category has gone up by 50%. And so what I see in my career is an epidemic of blindness, of people not feeling seen, valued, and heard. And when you feel yourself not seen, you regard that as an insult, which it is, and an injustice, which it is. And so you lash out. And so a society that becomes more sad eventually becomes more mean. And so I was at a restaurant in New York, and the owner told me he has to kick people out of the restaurant every week now for rude behavior. Never used to happen. My sister-in-law is a head nurse at a hospital in Camden, and apparently her main challenge is keeping nurses because the patients have become so abusive, the nurses want to leave their profession. And so that's just sadness and meanness. And so why is all this happening? Well, I could tell a bunch of stories. One of them would be the technology story. Social media is driving us crazy. One would be a sociology story. We're not as involved in civic life as we used to be. One would be an economic story. There's more income inequality than there used to be. And so we lead disparate lives. But the story I emphasize is the most direct, which is we become sadder and meaner because we don't treat each other with the consideration that we deserve. And treating each other with consideration and we deserve is partly a matter of just being open-hearted toward each other. But it's crucially a matter of skills. To be a good friend, to be a good parent, to be a good teacher, to be a good colleague requires certain social skills. How do you be a good listener? How do you reveal vulnerability in an appropriate place? How do you offer criticism in a way that's caring? How do you disagree well? How do you sit with someone who's suffering? And so in my view, we don't teach these skills anymore, if we ever did. And so people go awash in social ignorance. And so my book is simply an attempt to walk us through the skills it takes to know another human being and make them feel known, seen, and heard. And so I would ask you, how good are you at these skills? Well, I haven't met most of you, but I can tell you with great confidence, you're not as good as you think you are. There's a guy at the University of Texas who studies this, and the average person, when they meet a stranger and start a conversation with them, they accurately understand what's going on in that person's head 20% of the time. With friends and family, it goes up to 35% of the time. Some people are pretty good, they're 55% of the time, and some people are 0% of the time, but think they're 100% of the time. We're often strangers to each other. In any group of people, there are people who are diminishers and there are illuminators. The diminishers are not curious about other people. They stereotype, they ignore, they don't ask questions. I sometimes leave a party and I think, that whole time nobody asked me a question. And I've come to recognize that my conclusion is that only about 30% of the people you meet are question askers. They persistently are curious about you. The other 70% are perfectly nice people. They're just not questioners. And those are diminishers. Illuminators, on the other hand, are people who are curious about you and make you feel special and lit up. And so there was a novelist who wrote about 100 years ago named Ian Foster. And his biographer said of him, to speak to him was to be seduced by an inverse charisma, a sense of being listened to with such intensity that you had to be your most honest, sharpest, and best self. Who wouldn't want to be able to bring out that in other people? There's a probably apocryphal story told about Jenny Jerome, who would later go on to become Winston Churchill's mom. And in the late 19th century, when she was a young woman, one night she was seated next to a dinner in London with William Gladstone, the Prime Minister of England. And she left that dinner thinking that Gladstone was the cleverest person in England. Then a couple weeks later, she's seated at a dinner next to Gladstone's great political rival, Benjamin Disraeli. And she left dinner with Disraeli thinking that she was the cleverest person in England. And so it's good to be Gladstone. It's better to be Disraeli. Many of you probably know the vaunted research facility, Bell Labs. They had a bunch of researchers, and some of them were just more creative and innovative than others. And they wanted to know why. And so they checked out their IQs, they checked out their educational backgrounds, and they couldn't figure it out. It turned out the most creative researchers were in the habit of having breakfast or lunch every day with a guy named Harry Nyquist, who's an electrical engineer. And he got inside their problems, he got inside their head, he asked them the good questions, and he walked with them as they solved their problems. And so Harry Nyquist is an illuminator. And so how do you get better at being an illuminator? Well, the first thing, whether you're young or more seasoned, is you study the humanities. You study literature, plays, the arts. The humanities are the most, I tell young people, the humanities are the most practical thing you can major in because they teach you about other people. And if you can't understand other people, you'll be miserable, and you'll make people around you miserable. Then, there's a series of steps one should walk through to really get to know somebody well and make them feel respected. And that series of steps begins with the first gaze. You're just encountering somebody, and you're looking at them. When we meet somebody, there's a series of unconscious questions going through our minds. Am I a priority to you? Am I a person to you? Will you respect me? And the answers to those questions are communicated in the eyes before any words come out of your mouth. I was in Waco, Texas several years ago, and I was having lunch with a woman named LaRue Dorsey. And Mrs. Dorsey was a teacher most of her career, and she presented herself to me as this stern disciplinarian, sort of a drill sergeant type. And she told me, I loved my students enough to discipline them. And so we're sitting there, and I'm a little intimidated by her. She was tough lady. And into the diner walks a mutual friend of ours named Jimmy Durrell, who's a pastor. He pastors the homeless. And he goes up to her, and he grabs her by the shoulders and shakes her way harder than you should shake a 93-year-old. And he says, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best, I love you. And that stern disciplinarian that I had been talking to turns into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. And so the moral of the story is greet people more like Jimmy and less like me. And that's partly because he's a warm, big personality. But partly the profound thing is this. Jimmy's a pastor, as I mentioned. And so when Jimmy greets anybody, he's greeting anybody made in the image of God. He's looking into the face of God. He's looking at somebody with a soul of infinite value and dignity. He's looking at somebody so important that Jesus was willing to die for that person. Now, you could be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, atheist, agnostic, I don't care. But greeting each person you meet with that level of reverence and respect is a precondition for seeing them well. To know that each person you meet is not a problem to be solved. They're a mystery that you will never get to the bottom of. So it's that first gaze is so powerful. Attention is a moral act. The kind of attention we cast on the world determines the kind of person we are in the world. So that's the gaze. The second phase of getting to know someone is what I call accompaniment. Most of life is not having deep conversations with other people. It's just hanging out. It's picking up your kids at school or attending a meeting. Accompaniment is an other-centered way of being a normal course of life. We think of the pianist who accompanies a singer. The pianist is there paying attention to the singer. He's there to make her shine. And so we want to have that other-centered way of being. And sometimes it can be just as casual as hanging out. I have friends who say, we like our friends to be lingerable. When they come for dinner, we just want to linger with them. They're fun. That's a great quality of accompaniment. The second is play. When you're playing with someone, you don't have to have deep conversations, whether it's pickleball or Uno or basketball or whatever. But when you're at play, you're yourself. You're more natural. I have friends who I played basketball with, and you can imagine how good I am. And we've never really had deep conversations, but we've had trash talk and high fives, and we pass the ball, and we really sort of know each other. You can see how powerful it was when my oldest son, was about 14 or 12 months, I can't remember. He woke up at 4 in the morning every morning, and I played with him till 10 a.m. when I left. And I remember thinking one day, you know, I know him better than I've ever known anybody. And he's known me better than anybody's known me because I was so emotionally open in play. And no words had crossed between us because he couldn't yet talk. And yet there was a deep bond between us. Sometimes accompaniment is just being present. It's just showing up at the right time. So I had a student a couple years ago, 2 years ago, named Jillian Sawyer. And Jillian's dad died of pancreatic cancer while she was in college. And as he was dying, they talked about the fact that he would probably miss some of the big events of her life, like her wedding. And after college, she was a bridesmaid at a friend's wedding. And she went through the wedding. She watched the father give a toast to his daughter, a beautiful toast, the father of the bride. And then it came time for the father-daughter dance. And she just didn't want to sit through that, so she left the table and went to the restroom quietly just to have a cry. And when she came out of the restroom, all the people at her table and the adjacent table had gotten up and were just standing by the door of the restroom. And she wrote this in a paper that she gave me permission to quote from. What I will remember forever is that no one said a word. Each person, including newer boyfriends who I knew less well, gave me a reaffirming hug and headed back to their table. No one lingered or awkwardly tried to validate my grief. They were there for me, just for a moment, and it was exactly what I needed. That's a beautiful example of just the art of presence, just showing up for somebody. So that's the second phase. The third phase is conversation. You have to be really good conversationalists to get to know other people and to have the kind of encounters you want to have. And so how good are you at conversation? Well, again, I don't know you that well, but you're probably not as good as you think you are. It's easy to have bad conversations. That's two people making statements at each other. That's a bad conversation. A good conversation goes somewhere. People say something and the other person says, yeah, that's good, let me build on that. And then build on that. And we started at one place, we ended up over here. I asked a bunch of conversation experts, what are some tips to become a better conversationalist? And they gave me a bunch, a few of which I'll repeat here. One, treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. It should be 100% attention or 0%, but not 60%. Two, be a loud listener. I have a buddy named Andy Crouch who lives in Swarthmore. And when you're talking to him, it's like talking to a Pentecostal church. He's like, amen, brother, preach that. And I just love talking to that guy. Make them authors, not witnesses. When people tell you a story, they don't go into enough detail. And so if you say, well, where was your boss sitting when she said that to you? Suddenly they're narrating you a story. You want to get people in a story mode. Even in journalism, I no longer ask people, what do you believe about this? I ask them, how did you come to believe that about this? That's it. They start telling me a story about some experience they had or some person who've shaped their values. A much better conversation. Don't fear the pause. If we're in conversation and I make a comment that starts on my shoulder and goes to my fingertips, at what point have you stopped listening so you can start thinking what you're going to say in response? Probably here. So let me talk to my fingertips and then pause, and then you can have a thoughtful response. Don't be a topper. Topping is when you say something about how you're having problems with your teenage son, and I say, I know exactly what you're going through. I'm having problems with my Tommy. It sounds like I'm trying to relate, but what I'm really doing is say, I don't really care about your problems. Let me talk about my own. And so don't be a topper. Two final ones. Keep the gem statement in the center. When we have an argument, there's usually something deep down we agree upon. If my brother and I are arguing about our dad's health care, we both want what's best for our dad. And so if we could keep that point of agreement, the gem statement in the center, you save a relationship in the midst of an argument. And then the final one is find the disagreement under the disagreement. When we disagree about something like tax policy, there's probably some philosophical reason we see it differently. So let's explore what that is. It's a more fun way to have a conversation. Finally, the quality of your conversation depends on the quality of the questions you ask. And so we should get really good at asking great questions. Now, kids are phenomenal at asking questions. I have a friend named Naomi Way who teaches 7th grade boys in New York how to be interviewers, how to ask questions. Her first day in class, she said, okay, you guys can ask me anything, and I'll answer honestly. First question from a 7th grade boy, are you married? No. Second question, are you divorced? Yes. Third question, do you still love him? Her eyes widen. She says yes. Fourth question, does he know? Do your kids know? By now she's crying. So kids are great questioners. And as adults, we get a little shy about it. Too shy, in my view. And so we want to get good at asking questions. And sometimes you're just getting to know someone. You're not going to ask some deep, profound question. I ask people sometimes, like, I always ask people, where are you from, or where'd you get your name, or tell me your favorite unimportant thing about yourself. I learned from that question, an academic I revere watches a lot of trashy TV, but that's his favorite unimportant thing about him. But you want the questions to be open-ended storytelling questions. So I read in a book called You're Not Listening by Keith Murphy about a focus group moderator who was hired by grocery stores to find out why people are coming into the grocery stores late at night. And she could have just said, tell me, why do you go to grocery stores late at night, to the focus group? Instead, she said, tell me about the last time you went to a grocery store after 11 p.m. And one lady who'd been quiet through the whole focus group said, well, I had smoked a joint, and I wanted a menage a trois with me, Ben, and Jerry. And so you got a little glimpse into her life. Once you get to know somebody, my favorite questions are ones that take them out of their daily experience and get them 30,000 feet looking at their life. And so it's like, what crossroads are you at? Most of us are in some life transition. What crossroads are you at? If this 5 years of your life is a chapter, what's the chapter about? What would you do if you weren't afraid? I had a friend who was being interviewed for a job, and at the end of the interview, he said to the interviewer, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And the lady burst out crying, because she wouldn't be doing HR at that company. I asked my students at Yale, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And every year, 2 or 3 say, well, I wouldn't be at Yale. It's not the right school for me, but I need the prestige. And so fear governs all our lives to some degree. Peter Block, who writes about community, has some great questions, but you really have to know people to ask these ones. What's the no or refusal you keep postponing? What's the commitment you've made you no longer really believe in? What's the gift you hold in exile? What talent do you have that you're not using? These are deep questions. I once had a dinner party, and my wife thought I was really pretentious, but it worked. I asked, how do your ancestors show up in your life? Because we've all been shaped by our ancestors. And there was a Dutch family, and they talked about their Dutch heritage. There was a black family. They talked about the African-American experience. I talked about Jewish heritage. And it was a great conversation, because we all knew we were affected by our heritages, but we hadn't really pinned it down. So we had a great conversation talking about that. And so these are the easy parts of getting to know somebody under the normal circumstances of life. Now, we happen to live in a time that's not normal. And so to have a graduate degree level of social connection with other people, you've got to be able to make that connection under unfavorable circumstances. And so I had a friend, that I mentioned all the mental health problems. I had a friend named Peter Marks, who we were friends since we were 11. And Peter had this seemingly charmed life. He had a great wife, wonderful kids. He was an eye surgeon. But at age 57, he got hit by a very severe depression. And I thought I was well-educated, but I didn't know what depression was really. I learned that you can't understand depression by extrapolating from your moments of sadness. Depression is not like that. As Michael Gerson said, depression is a malfunction in the instrument people use to perceive reality. And so in the case of my friend, he had these vicious lying voices in his head saying, you're worthless, nobody would miss you if you're gone. And so I didn't quite understand how severe the despair and the pain really was. And so I made social skill mistakes. And a lot of this was over COVID. We were talking by phone. And so in the beginning, I tried to give him ideas about how we could make the depression lift. And so I said, well, you used to do these service trips to Vietnam. Why don't you do that again? And when you do that, I learned, all you're doing is showing the depressed person you don't get it. Because it's not ideas that the depressed person is missing. It's energy and a lot of other stuff. And then the second mistake I made was to say, your life is so great. Appreciate what you have around you. And basically, I was just telling him, you should be enjoying the things you're palpably not enjoying. And how better to make somebody feel even worse. And so I think I learned gradually over the time that a friend's job in that circumstance is just to acknowledge how much the situation sucks and to remind him, you'll be there, I'll be there forever. I'm not going away from this. There's no abandonment here. And I wish I had sent him more text, little touches just through the day. No response necessary. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, when he would counsel people who were contemplating suicide, he said, life has not stopped expecting things of you. And it seems harsh to me, but he says it calls people to understand the effect they have on the world and the effect they can have on the world. Because in times like these, people who have been through some suffering have the credibility to talk to other people through their own process of suffering. There's a great quote from Thornton Wilder, "Without your wound, where would your power be? It is your very remorse that makes your low voice tremble in the hearts of men. The very angels themselves cannot persuade the wretched and blundering children on earth, as can one human being broken on the wheel of living. In love's service, only wounded soldiers can serve." And that's the power of it that a depressed person can have on the world, or someone who's been through this. Now, sadly, Peter succumbed to suicide about a year and a half ago. And nothing I said, there are things I said wrong, but nothing I could have said would have made any difference. The monster was just bigger than Peter, and it was going to be bigger than the rest of us. And so it was a hard lesson. So that's one kind of social skill that unfortunately has become necessary for so many people. How to sit with people who are going through depression, mental health issues, grief. The second kind of hard conversation that has become unfortunately necessary is conversations across ideological difference, across class difference, across racial difference, across any kind of difference. And these can sometimes be hard conversations. Often when you're in these conversations, there's critique and there's blame, especially me. I walk into a room, I come associated with the New York Times, with Yale University. I come pretty establishment elite credentials. And a lot of people on both left and right see me as part of the systems of oppression that keep them down. And so there's often criticism. And my instinct is to be defensive. Oh, I'm not the problem here, I'm one of the good guys. You don't understand the things I'm dealing with. But I've come to appreciate that in this world, my job, and I think all our jobs when we're talking across difference, is to stand in the other person's standpoint. It's to ask the other person in 3 separate ways, in 3 different kinds, what am I missing here? Tell me more about your point of view. Tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. And if you ask them 3 or 4 times in different ways, you'll be astonished how the 3rd and 4th answer is deeper, richer, and more complicated than the first answer. So you learn a lot. But second, you show respect. You show respect from their point of view. And there's a great book called Crucial Conversations. And in that book, they say, in every conversation, respect is like air. When it's present, nobody notices. And when it's absent, it's all anybody can think about. And in any conversation, your conversation is happening on 2 different levels. What we're nominally talking about, and the under conversation, which is the flow of emotion passing between us. With every comment I make, I'm either making you feel safer or less safe. I'm either showing you respect or not. I'm either showing you my motivations for telling you this or I'm not. And so it's to pay attention to that emotional conversation underneath. And these skills of from the first gaze to the conversation to hard conversations amid conflict, these to me are the essence of moral life. Sure, moral life is big things like reporting embezzlement at a workplace, telling the truth at a trial. But to me, the essence of morality is to be a genius at the close of hand. Iris Murdoch, the novelist and philosopher, said morality is something that happens in the minutiae of day-to-day encounter. And our job, normally we see the world through self-serving eyes. Our job is to get the self out of the way and enter reality. And to, she says, cast a just and loving attention on the people around us. And that's how we prove who we are and how we show up in the world. And so I ask people now, tell me about times you feel seen. And some of my favorite ones are just little daily things. Like there's some big epical moments, but people with glowing eyes will tell me about times they really felt seen. And so I had a guy tell me, well, my daughter in second grade was struggling in the year in class, and the teacher one day said to her, you know, you're really good at thinking before you speak. And that one comment turned the girl's year around, because it took that moment, which she thought was social awkwardness, her weakness, it turned it into a strength. And as he told me that story, I thought of my own 11th grade teacher, Mrs. Dewsnap at Radnor. I was making some smart-ass comment at class, which is what I did. And she said, David, you're getting by on glibness, stop it. And on the one hand, I was humiliated. She called me out in front of the whole class. On the other hand, I thought, wow, she really knows me. Wow, I'm so honored. A woman in her 30s told me a story about when she was 13, she had her first taste of alcohol and got so drunk she was just lying. She couldn't move on the front porch of her house. And her dad, who was a strict disciplinarian, loomed in the doorway, and she thought he's going to scream at me all the things that are already in my head. I'm bad, I'm bad, I'm bad. Instead, he just scooped her up, brought her inside, laid her on the sofa, and said, there'll be no punishment here. You've just had an experience. And 25 years later, she remembered that moment as the time her dad really got her and knew she didn't need to be screamed at that moment. And so these are long memories. There's a guy named Rabbi Elliot Kukla who tells a story about a woman who has a brain injury, and so sometimes she'll just fall to the ground. And she told him, I think people rush to help me up because they are so uncomfortable with seeing an adult lying on the floor. But what I really need is for someone to get down on the ground with me. And that's empathy. It's knowing not what makes me comfortable, but what you need at that moment. And when people do that, that's also great times of great seeing. I'll give you a few examples, and these are a little more profound, of what great seeing can do, because it's a creative act that changes relationships and, in my view, changes societies. One of them, it's just handy to be able to see people well. Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, 34, something like that, met a guy, came to his office named Lyndon Johnson, who was then a 28-year-old congressman. And after the meeting, FDR says to his aide, Harold Ickes, you know, Harold, that's the kind of uninhibited young pro I might have been as a young man if I hadn't gone to Harvard. And then FDR continued, in the next couple of generations, the balance of power in this country is going to shift to the South and West. And that kid, Lyndon Johnson, could well be our first Southwestern president. Pretty good. Some of you probably know the movie Good Will Hunting. And in that movie, Matt Damon plays this math genius, Robin Williams plays his therapist, and Matt Damon goes through the movie eviscerating people with his wit, including Robin Williams' character. Williams pulls him out to a pond and gives him a longer version of the following speech. You're a tough kid. I ask you about war. You probably throw Shakespeare at me, right? Once more into the breach, dear friends. But you've never been near one. You've never held your best friend's head in your lap and watched him gasp his last breath. I ask you about love, you probably quote me a sonnet. But you've never looked at a woman and been totally vulnerable, known someone who could level you with her eyes. I look at you, I don't see an intelligent, confident man. I see a cocky, scared, shitless kid. You're a genius, Will, no one denies that. Personally, I don't care about all that. I can't learn anything from you that I can't read in some book. Unless you want to talk about you, sport who you are, then I'm fascinated. But you don't want to do that. You're terrified of what you might say. And so that little speech comes from great listening. In the first place, he's heard the very thing the Matt Damon character is most desperate to hide, which is how terrified he is of life. And second, it's a great critique with care. He's saying there are two kinds of knowledge in the world. There's book knowledge, and then there's the personal wisdom you acquire by risking things emotionally and having experiences. You have book knowledge. You don't have the knowledge that really matters. And so he does that with unconditional love, and he points the Damon character in the direction he needs to go. It's just a beautiful example of wisdom. I read a story in a book called Lost and Found by Catherine Schultz. And in that book, she describes her father as this cheerful, talkative, gregarious guy. a guy who had opinions on everything from infield fly rule to whether apple cobbler was better than apple crisp. He just sounds like a wonderful guy. And he aged, and as he got old and sick, suddenly he just stopped talking. And nobody could figure out why. And so the family visited him in the hospital in those final weeks. And she writes, "I had always regarded my family as close. So it was startling to realize how much closer we get, how near we drew around his waning flame." And then one evening at the very end, he sat in the room, and the family all went around the room, and they all said the things they didn't want to leave unsaid. And Schultz writes, "My father, mute but seemingly alert, looked from one face to another as we spoke, his brown eyes shining with tears. I had always hated to see him cry and seldom did, but for once I was grateful. It gave me hope for what may have been the last time in his life, and perhaps the most important, he understood. If nothing else, I knew that everywhere he looked that evening, he found himself where he'd always been with his family, the center of the circle, the source and subject of our abiding love." And so that was a guy who died well seen. And it's just profound for the people to be involved in that kind of experience. And if it's great to be seen, I can tell you it's also great to be the one who does the seeing. So once, about 2 years ago, I was sitting at my house in DC, and I was reading a boring book at the dining room table, which is what I'm paid to do. And my wife opens the front door, which you can see from the dining room table, and she pauses in the doorway. And the summer sun is streaming in behind her, and she doesn't really notice I'm there, because that's the kind of charisma I have. But her eyes rest on an orchid that we keep on a table by the door. And she's just thinking about something. And I have this sensation wash across my mind, which is, I know her. I really know her. I know her through and through. And if you had asked me at that moment what I knew about her, it wasn't the personality traits I would describe to a stranger, or even what she was thinking. It was the ebbs and flow of her music, the harmony of her way of being, the incandescence of her personality, the moments of fierceness, the moments of insecurity. It was as if I wasn't seeing her. For a brief moment, I was seeing out from her. And when you really know someone, you see the world a little from their point of view. And if you had asked me what word I was to describe how I was looking at her, the only word in the English language I can think of is the word beholding. I was just beholding her, which is like just appreciation. And it was just a beautiful moment. I told an older couple this story recently, and they said, "Yeah, that's what we do with our grandkids. We just behold." And they say you can never really get to know a stranger. I think that's wrong. I think in examples in my life and in many of the lives of people I've spoken to, there have been moments when that profound act of seeing another person really does happen. And out of that, if we live in a dehumanizing age, then seeing another human being is the most practical and aggressively effective way to fight back at dehumanization. And we live at a time when people are not seeing each other. In this country and in the Middle East and everywhere. And it's a brutalizing time to be here. And the natural urge is to cower in, close in, be protective. And I understand that urge. But the people I admire at this time are the defiant humanists who say, I will not be calloused over. I will not put up the barriers. I will not declare war on the others. I will be defiant enough to do the essential humanistic act, which is to try to understand your point of view. Try to acknowledge you as a person worthy of respect and investigation and curiosity. And it's not naive to lead with respect. It's not naive to lead with trust. It's not naive to lead with curiosity. To me, it's the most practical and effective things we can do in a time of brutal dehumanization. Thank you very much.